The Waqf Amendment Bill has been passed by the two houses of the parliament, in the Lok Sabha and in the Rajya Sabha. It took some long hours, but it has been finally passed by the NDA-led government. Now, why is this important? I'm still calling it a bill because until the Honorable President doesn't give her assent, it continues to remain a bill. But once the assent comes in, it's notified, it becomes an act. Before we dive into the intricacies of the bill, because a lot of people are professing their ideas, their opinions around this bill, it's important to understand what was at stake here. And therefore, I have a request to make. I urge you all to watch the first part of the Waqf Explainer series on our channel to understand what was really at stake. Between 1954 and 2013, several deliberations, discussions happened around the Waqf boards, around how Waqf properties need to be managed, and most of it happened under the Congress government. From Nehru to Sonia Gandhi's government until 2013, Waqf underwent a lot of change. But unfortunately, the Waqf was empowered in as many as 15 ways that we've discussed in the first part. And however, the government's role, the role of the judiciary, all of it was diluted. Therefore, before we understand what this bill really changes for the Muslims and the non-Muslims, it's important to understand what was really at stake here. Ironically, the people on the left side of the political spectrum believe that a lot has been done via this bill to curb the rights of the Muslims. The people on the right side of the spectrum believe that not much has been done to empower the non-Muslim groups. The devil, as always, lies in the details. Now, the first important change in the bill is the definition of those who can make a dedication to the Waqf. In 2013, in the final months of the UPA, an amendment was made to the Principal Act, the Waqf 1995 Act, where it changed the definition of any person professing Islam to any person. Therefore, the Waqf became a problem for the non-Muslims because they didn't even realize, but now they were a part of the Waqf ecosystem. Because any non-Muslim, be it a Hindu, a Sikh, a Christian, a Buddhist, a Jain or a Parsi, was now a part of that act. But in the 2025 bill, the definition has been changed. The definition of those who can make a dedication to the Waqf. Now the definition says that any person who wishes to make a dedication to the Waqf must have been practicing Islam for at least 5 years. Now the Congress was quick to jump the gun, asking, how will you define someone who has been practicing Islam for the last 5 years? How do they prove that they have been practicing Islam for the last 5 years? This is where the rules of the bill, or when it becomes an act, become really important. How the person practicing Islam, will it be their government documents? Will it be something that they use in public life? However, it will be defined. But the important part here is not what it does to the Muslims. The important part here is that it now excludes non-Muslims who were not supposed to be a part of the Waqf ecosystem in the first place, had it not been for the 2013 amendment. Therefore, the first big change, Hindus or non-Muslims are now no longer a part of the Waqf ecosystem. Now, how did Waqf become a nightmare, a headache, literally, for the government? In 2013, when the set of amendments was passed in the parliament, the definition of encroacher on Waqf properties was changed. The definition was changed to include the government properties as well, the lands owned by the government. Think about this. In the final months of the UPA government, somehow the Congress thought it was an intelligent idea to include properties owned by the government as encroached properties, potentially for the Waqf ecosystem. Why? We don't know. But in the 2025 bill, this has been done away with. The 2025 bill clearly makes an exception retrospectively as well to the government properties. And this is where the second big change has happened. If I read out the definition from the 2025 bill of the government properties, it says that the government organizations include central government, state government, municipalities, panchayats attached and subordinate offices, and autonomous bodies of the central government or state government, or any organization or institution owned and controlled by the central government or the state government. So there were a lot of people saying, what happens to the ASI properties now? I think this change addresses that aspect as well. More importantly, the government will now not be superseded by the Waqf ecosystem. Now coming to the third big change, and for that I'll read out a clause from the 2025 bill that made headlines on social media. People just read this part of the bill and made their own conclusions and said that the bill was underwhelming, that it was unjust against the non-Muslims. What was that clause? The clause said that provided that the existing Waqf by user properties registered on or before the commencement of the Waqf Amendment Act 2025 as Waqf by user will remain as Waqf properties, except that the property wholly or in part is in dispute or is a government property. Now this clause was very clear about one thing, that the government properties do not remain Waqf properties, even if they are registered. However, the people had this question about the retrospective impact on properties that were disputed, and this is where the Waqf by user concept becomes very, very important. For those who don't remember, in part 1 we discussed that the Waqf by user clause was introduced under the Nehru government in 1954. What is Waqf by user? For instance, you own a land parcel, or the land parcel is adjacent to your house. One fine day, someone walks up to that land parcel and starts offering a prayer. That goes on for 1 year, for 5 years, for 10 years, 15 years. And someday in the 20th year, someone says that this land parcel, irrespective of its owner, irrespective of its value, irrespective of its utility, is being used for a religious purpose, and therefore verbally I can dedicate it as a Waqf property, even if I don't own it. This was Waqf by user, that any land can be dedicated as a Waqf property purely and purely based on how it was being utilized, even if the utilization was not happening from the owner. And this clause says that if these Waqf properties are not registered, they cease to be Waqf properties. Now here's the interesting part. Around 37 lakh acres worth of land falls under the Waqf. 22 lakh acres is almost Waqf by user properties. 8.7 lakh worth of properties under the Waqf. Over 4 lakh properties are Waqf by user properties. Now this is where the word registered in the clause becomes very, very important. When we hear register, we hear proper documentation. So one would assume even if a verbal dedication has been made, the documentation would be proper. But that's not the case by Waqf by user properties. All these properties were being verbally dedicated just based on the long-term usage of these properties. Not tomorrow, if there is a government land which often lies vacant for a lot of years, a group of people start offering a prayer there. Will they be in a position to claim it as a Waqf land after 5, 10, 15, 20 years? Absolutely not. From a economic angle, that doesn't make any sense, but that is what Waqf by user was allowing, and this act, this clause was introduced in 1954. The 2025 bill does away with it. That is where the Waqf by user now comes to an end, and the verbal dedication will no longer be valid. If you have the paperwork, the property belongs to you. If you do not have the paperwork, now is the time for a legal dispute. Now, when we were in school, in class 6 or class 7 perhaps, we were taught that mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. Mitochondria is where the cell derives its power from. Similarly, section 40 of the 1995 Waqf Act was where the Waqf ecosystem drew its power from. What did section 40 say? To put it simply, it said that if the Waqf believes that a property belongs to them, they can investigate it and lay a claim on it. It doesn't matter what the law said, it doesn't matter what the owner said, nothing else mattered. Lock, stock, barrel. If the Waqf believes something belonged to them, it literally belonged to them. And that is how the story of that village from Tamil Nadu, the temple that was 1500 years old, all the government buildings, all of them started to become Waqf properties, disputed properties, or those 120 odd properties from Delhi, which the UPA merrily gave away before they were voted out of power. But here's the interesting thing. Let's not look at section 40 in isolation. Let's combine it with the Waqf by user concept. Now, section 40 says the Waqf can stake a claim on any property they believe belongs to them. In the investigation, if they started using the logic that was being applied in Waqf by user, what would happen to the land on which Ram Mandir has been built today in Ayodhya? Some would get up 100 years later and say that 100 years before, some religious practices were done here and therefore this is a Waqf land. This is how Waqf by user and Section 40 together were dangerous to the non-Muslim groups because they did not have any accountability mechanism within them. They did not have any transparency in them. The opaqueness made it possible for the Waqf ecosystem literally to stake claim on any and every parcel of land they wanted to. And this is why it was very, very important to address Section 40. And the government did that. The government omitted Section 40 altogether from the new amendments. They said that the Section 40 will no longer be a part of the Waqf Act, a cold-hearted end, one would say, to the mitochondria of the Waqf ecosystem. Now let's say you are one of the aggrieved parties. The Waqf has told you your house, your office, your land, one you saved up for retirement belongs to them. What could you do before 2025? You could go to the Waqf Tribunal that was Muslim dominated and make an appeal. In all probability, the tribunal would have ruled against you, and unfortunately, the tribunal's decision was binding. And even if you could approach the High Court or the Supreme Court, your options were quite limited as explained by Home Minister Amit Shah in the Parliament. But now, in the 2025 bill, at least in 5 different places, the finality of the tribunal has been done away with. At 5 different places within the bill, the finality has been omitted clearly. The tribunal is no longer the dictating force. Now look at this. Look at this dismantling of the Waqf ecosystem. Waqf by user, which allowed verbal dedications, has been omitted. Section 40, which allowed the Waqf to stake claim on any property, has been dealt with. And also the finality of the Waqf tribunals, dominated by the Muslim groups, has also been now addressed. People can approach the high courts directly within 90 days. And another interesting aspect, the judiciary's overreach has also been increased. The bill says that any Waqf properties that is not registered on the designated portal cannot be entertained for a suit in the courts. It's that simple. If someone says that this is a Waqf property, they need to have the paperwork, they need to have the registration done, only then they can move court. And when it comes to the aggrieved parties, unlike before, they can now move directly to the higher court without worrying about the bindingness of the tribunal decision. They can move to the High Court and appeal within 90 days. This is where the power has been restored to the judiciary. Even during the British Raj, and we discussed this in the first video, even during the British Raj, the courts had certain degree of power, but between 1954 and 2013, this power of the judiciary, the accountability factor, as some would say, was steadily diluted in the name of perhaps vote bank politics. Now the next set of big changes in the bill are sort of the lifelines for the Waqf ecosystem. They were the lifelines rather for the Waqf ecosystem. Remember Section 107, the Limitations Act of 1963? Let me break it down for you. Suppose you moved to America in 2005 and a land parcel that was owned by your family, the one you left behind, was occupied illegally in 2010. Now the law stated that you had 12 years to file a recovery suit in any of the courts. So if your land was illegally grabbed in 2010, you could file a suit until 2022. This was what the law said. But with Waqf, there was an exception. The Waqf did not have to worry about this 12-year foundation, this 12-year limit. The Waqf could go to the courts or other go to the tribunals 50, 100, 150 years later and say, this land belongs to us, we want it back. Section 107 in the new bill has been modified. The Limitations Act is now applicable to the Waqf ecosystem. That's the first lifeline gone, because you combine Section 40, Waqf by user, the definition of who can make a dedication, and now see Section 107 on that front. You realize that Section 107 actually allowed the Waqf ecosystem not to be worried about the age limit. Think about this. Section 40 and 107 together. Section 40 says, lay claim to whatever you think belongs to you. Section 107 says you do not have to worry about the time limit, not about the 12 years. So in any area where the Muslims became a majority or the non-Muslims became a minority, the combination, the culmination of both these sections would have allowed the Waqf ecosystem to sort of grab lands, and that is what many were worried about, and that is what is now addressed. Coming to the next lifeline that was ushered by the UPA for the Waqf ecosystem, and for this I'll read out 104B from the 2013 amendments. It said if any Waqf property has been occupied by the government agencies, it shall be returned to the board or to the custodian within a period of 6 months from the date of the order of the tribunal. The order of the tribunal here means the Waqf Tribunal. So essentially the UPA, while leaving the office, was saying that the government is now inferior to the Waqf. If the Waqf believes that the land parcel belongs to them, all the tribunal had to do was issue an order to the government, and the government was obligated to vacate that piece of land in 6 months. Section 104 altogether has been omitted from the new bill, for it also made the land transfers very difficult. It also made land acquisition very difficult. The tribunals had to order the government what rents to give, what compensation to give. So this supersession of the tribunals over the government, that has come to an end. But an important question, why would any government, be it a government of the Congress, be it a government of the left, be it a government that is working because of minority appeasement, why would any government make the government itself inferior to an ecosystem like that of the Waqf? The third lifeline gifted by the UPA, the Congress government, by leaving office to the Waqf ecosystem. Section 108 and 108A. Section 108 dealt with the evacuee properties, the properties that were left behind by the migrants in 1947 when they moved to Pakistan. But Section 108A was very, very important. Section 108A gave the Waqf ecosystem the power to override conflicting laws. So think about this. If there is a case in the court and there are 3 sets of laws, one dealing with the land transaction rules, one dealing with the land acquisition rules, something related to the property law, and then the Waqf law, the 108A section suggested that the Waqf law would override them all. This was the final immunity. So 107, 104, 108. This is where the 3 lifelines strengthened the Waqf ecosystem, and all of them were steadily empowering the Waqf ecosystem for all these 10 years. That is why Amit Shah said that until 2013, the Waqf ecosystem had around 18 lakh acres worth of land, but suddenly in the next 10 years, they added 21 lakh acres to their kitty. How was this happening? This was happening because of the amalgamation of Section 40, Waqf by user, the change in definition of those making the dedication, the role of the judiciary being diluted to absolutely nothing, the power of the tribunals, and the 3 lifelines. Section 104, the non-applicability of Limitations Act of 1963, which is Section 107, and Section 108A, which gave them the overriding power. This was the Waqf ecosystem, and all of this, Section 104, 108 and 108A have been omitted. And of course, Section 40, which now stands omitted from the new Waqf Bill. Now let's take up a few questions that have been doing the rounds on social media. We've discussed the 8 big changes that have been made to the Waqf ecosystem via the Waqf Bill of 2025. But let's look at the ground impact. Let's analyze what changes are really going to be witnessed on the ground. Let's take the first question. What does the bill do for the non-Muslims, starting with the Hindus? Well, for starters, it excludes non-Muslims from the dedication part. Now, non-Muslims are not to be troubled, or they don't have to be worried about dedicating a property to the Waqf, because the law doesn't recognize any dedication that is made by someone who's not practicing Islam for at least 5 years. The law will also not recognize any dedication that is not made by the owner of the property. Waqf by user is gone, Section 40 is gone, the definition that included non-Muslims is gone. So for starters, it does a lot for the Hindus by simply excluding them from the Waqf ecosystem. Where does it leave the retrospective properties that were claimed by the Waqf? Now the law is very clear here. The law says that the properties of Waqf by user that were registered before the commencement of the act will remain Waqf properties. But here's the big question. How many properties are actually registered given they were dedicated verbally? Also, no government properties, even retrospectively, are now going to be qualifying as Waqf properties. So when you talk about retrospective properties, government properties are an exception. The law is very clear about that. And the law is also clear that the properties that are registered, that need to also be registered on the designated online portal within 6 months of the commencement of the act, only they'll be realized as Waqf properties, as legitimate Waqf properties. And to reinstate that number, of the 37 lakh acres, 22 lakh acres is Waqf by user. Of the 8.7 lakh Waqf properties, more than 4 lakh are Waqf by user properties. How many of them actually have proper documentation? This is the time where we'll find it out. Kagas ab dikhane honge. A lot about non-Muslims, but where does it leave the Muslims, especially the economically backward Muslims, after the implementation of this bill, when it becomes an act? That's the question. Now, one has to understand, as the non-Muslims were aggrieved under the Waqf ecosystem, so were the Muslims. The land parcels were being locked up without any revenue generation. They had no option to go to the courts. It's easy to assume that the aggrieved parties under the Waqf ecosystem are only non-Muslims, which they are, but it's also the Muslims, especially the ones who cannot rescue the lands, who were suffering. The new law ensures that the dedication can only be made by people who own a certain property. So no one can now just randomly assign a property to the Waqf using section 40 or Waqf by user. And this is where the economically backward Muslims will feel empowered. Interestingly, one of the journalists who has been speaking against the Waqf ecosystem, speaking against the Waqf Amendment Bill of 2025 and the Modi government, and she's been writing columns about this, was actually asking the government to do something about the Waqf ecosystem back in 2017. Hence proved the Modi government listens to everyone's plight, even those who criticize it. Where does it leave the Waqf tribunals that had acquired unchecked arbitrary powers since 1995? Interestingly, the bill at 5 different places negates the finality of the tribunals. It's omitting that finality. And therefore now the aggrieved parties, be it the Waqf or be it the non-Muslims or even the Muslims, they can now all approach the courts directly with far less restrictions. So the power of the tribunals, one can say, has actually been negated completely with this new bill. The next question, where does it leave the government against the Waqf, given the land holdings of the Waqf disputed or legitimate? Well, section 104, the applicability of section 107, which includes the Limitations Act of 1963, and section 108A now empower the government. Unlike before, unlike 2013, unlike the Congress government era, when the government was asked to be inferior to the Waqf ecosystem, this is no longer the case. The government is now a superseding body to the Waqf ecosystem. The clauses are very clear. Any property, even retrospectively, that is owned by the government, and the definition of government organization is also very, very elaborate. They no longer are Waqf property. So it does empower the government far, far more compared to the Waqf ecosystem. This is one fundamental change from 2013 that we have witnessed in the new bill. Where does it leave the Waqf? After the bill, after it becomes an act, will the Waqf be in a position to acquire properties endlessly as it had been doing for the last 10 years? Absolutely not. The end of section 40, the end of Waqf by user, the end of including non-Muslims in the dedication of Waqf properties ensures that the Waqf can no longer go on an acquiring spree as it was doing for the last 10 years. All the empowerment that the Waqf ecosystem was gifted on a platter in 2013 by the then UPA government has now been negated, and therefore the future of Waqf in existence is secure. The future of Waqf as a management authority is secure, but that acquiring spree without even any paperwork, that has come to a swift end. What are the implications? What are the economic implications for this new bill when it becomes an act? A lot of people have been saying that we should be worried about the tariffs, the Trump tariffs, and we're discussing the Waqf Bill. Well, it's a mistake to assume that this bill doesn't have economic implications. Think about this. Kiran Rijiju spoke about the revenue from the Waqf lands, 37 lakh acre worth of Waqf lands, a revenue of 166 crore rupees annually. That comes down to rupees 500 approximately per acre of land. That from a single acre of land, you're only generating rupees 500 annually. You compare this with a delivery boy working to deliver a food parcel, he makes more money in a single day. You compare it with a farmer who follows the most regressive farming techniques, is on the bottom of the economic pyramid, and even he'll make 100 times that money from a single acre of land. So the question is, for all these years, for all these decades, what was the Waqf ecosystem doing with all these land parcels if they could only generate rupees 500 approximately from a single acre of land? This is the economic implication that must be addressed in the coming years. Finally, the last question. Does it do anything to undermine the stature of Muslims in India? Does this bill, when it becomes an act, take away their citizenship, their right to worship, their mosques, their places of worship, or their fundamental rights? Absolutely not. These rumors also came up during the implementation of CAA. This discussion also happens around the UCC. But this law, this bill has absolutely nothing to do with the citizenship, the rights, the mosque, the places of worship of the Muslims. The government here is not interested in the mosque. People need to understand. This bill is not about religion, it's about real estate, it's about the economic implications. This is about the unchecked authority of one ecosystem in the garb of religion. And that is why dispassionately people should look at it purely from a real estate point of view, not from a religion point of view. Now let's take a step back. We started with the quote from India's first Prime Minister in a letter he wrote to his chief ministers. What was his idea of Hindus versus Muslims? We started in 1954, the letter was in 1959, and we were in 2013 in the final months of the UPA when the final set of amendments were made to the Principal Act of 1995. But why should we look at the Waqf Act alone? Why should we look at the 2013 amendments alone? What was the Congress government trying to do really? You had the communal violence bill, which had to be sort of penalizing the majority community. You had the minority sub-quota that the Congress was pushing for before the Supreme Court. They started their pilot experiment in Andhra Pradesh in 2004. The religious reservation was struck down repeatedly by the High Court, even by the Supreme Court, yet they were going for it. And then you had the Waqf amendments in 2013. So you look at the communal violence bill, the Waqf amendments, and the minority sub-quota the Congress government was pushing for, and you combine it with the lessons they are giving on equity in their 2024 manifesto, the public work contract reservation in Karnataka in 2025, and all this only leads to one single answer. The Congress now wants to be a party of one religion, one community alone. Even if that community rejects the Congress for its regressive politics, the Congress's idea of 2025 is like that of the Muslim League from the pre-independence days, or one would expect the conclusions to be on the similar lines. Why was the Congress so hell-bent on diluting the powers of the government and empowering the Waqf? This is what this discussion has been really all about.